welcome to part 2 of my Empire race guide. In this section we'll be going over the Empire roster and how I believe every unit is best used in battle, as well as my recommended army compositions. Disclaimer, this guide is based on my personal experience and opinions and is by no means the definitive way to play the Empire. If you have a different strategy or want to add something to mine, please leave a comment down below. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into the video. The roster of the Empire is one of the most balanced in the game. They have access to a wide range of units suited to any situation, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're the best at everything. As you'll see during this video, being decent at everything comes at the cost of being godlike at anything. Onto the roster. Kicking off the infantry is the Empire's Spearmen, and for 300 gold you can't really go wrong. The others will have a bonus in damage and charge defense against large foes due to their spears, and are overall a decent enough front line for the early game. As they are a spear unit, I'd only recommend a couple of them per army, and in battle they are of course best used for defending your flanks from enemy cavalry and targeting any large foes that are causing trouble. They come in two variants, with and without shields. The shields give you a better defense against range units, so are definitely worth the extra 100 gold as you'll spend less replacing them over time. Next up to the plate are swordsmen. They are the meat of an early game army. I'd say 3 or 4 of these guys in an early game army should do alright as long as they're supported by cav and range units. In campaign they'll often be acting as a wall against the undead hordes, protecting your range units and allowing them to chip away at the hostile army. This does mean they tend to suffer a lot of casualties post-battle, so be prepared to replace these guys on a regular basis, but at the price point of 400 gold you don't really have to worry about that too much. Finally they are shielded, which gives them defense against ranged attacks. Flagellants, or flagellants, I guess, are the berserkers of the Empire roster. They charge into battle and cause a lot of damage with no fear, no control and no backup plan. They have the damage dealer trait because, here's a shock, they deal a lot of damage. They also have the frenzy ability, meaning that when they are at high health they cause increased damage. This would be a good thing if not for the fact they are totally unarmoured and have just 10 melee defense. These two things combined mean that once flagellants get into melee, they aren't going to last long against targets with any semblance of armour. But hey, they're unbreakable, so at least they won't run away when they lose all their health in the first 5 seconds of the fight. I'd only recommend using them alongside Volkmar the Grim, as he gives them some pretty good bonuses when they're in his army, but still only take 4 at most, and of course in battle there is only one strategy: hit them hard and hit them fast. The Halberdiers are up next, and they are the most elite of the anti-large infantry. They have armour-piercing damage as well as bonuses against large foes, so these guys can shred a war mammoth like it's nobody's business. They're not too bad in melee with infantry either, as long as it isn't anything too high tier. They'll easily hold their own against the likes of skeleton warriors and other units of similar tier, but anything more you'll need to support them with a few units of swordsmen. I'd consider halberds a direct replacement for spearmen, with the only downside being the lack of shields, meaning they're slightly more exposed to range attacks. I'd again recommend 2 units in your army just to protect your flanks and focus any large targets enemies might bring. Now might be a good time to say that my recommendations are for what I'd call a jack of all trades army, which is my go-to setup when making a new stack. If your enemies are bringing all mammoths, then by all means bring a lot of halberds, but as far as my guides go, I'm only focusing on, in my opinion, a well-rounded army. Finishing up the melee infantry are the legendary greatswords. There was a time before the Swordmasters of Earth where I'd probably tell you that they're one of the best infantry units in the game, but at the moment they're still good but not quite god tier. They're still anti-infantry, so can shred through several units of enemy infantry without too much trouble. They're also armour piercing, so even tough units will take a lot of damage from these guys. They're also armoured, so won't take too much damage themselves. Again, these guys aren't shielded, so beware of range units pick them off when you aren't looking. I'd recommend about 4 units of these guys in any late game army over flagellants any day of the week, because they are just far more versatile and better overall. Headline the missile infantry are the Free Company militia, and to be honest I don't really have a lot to say about these guys because I haven't really used them. Don't get me wrong, the idea of ranged units being decent in melee is a really good thing if it weren't for one problem. I already bring at least 6 units of melee troops, so why would I need more? On top of this they're also weak against armor, so aren't going to do much against anything except zombies. On the right side they do have really good range and vanguard deployment, but does that make them worth it? Hell no. In my opinion, if you can afford crossbows, don't bother with these guys, but if you're going to insist on taking them, I'd say around 3 units would be enough, and use them to focus less armoured units until they run out of ammo and send them into melee. Crossbowmen are great. They have great range and an arc, so can shoot right over your units without too much friendly fire. These guys don't do amazingly against armour, but are still very preferable to Free Company, just because they can apply much more pressure to units. It could just be the animation, but when they fire it seriously feels like that part in 300. In battle, the best use for these guys is to get them uphill from where the melee battle is taking place, so they can rain down onto enemy units with small risk of friendly fire. I'd recommend a 3-to-2 split between these guys and handguns in your armies. Speaking of which, handgunners are finishing off the missile infantry, and they're totally top tier for what stage in the game you unlock them at. They deal armour piercing damage, so can easily shred through even the toughest of late game units, if you let them. Unlike the crossbowmen, handgunners don't have an eye to their shots, so they need to flank around enemies to get shots off without the risk of friendly fire. This can put them out of position and leave them in danger of being charged, which would not be a good situation, as they have pretty poor melee stats. As I said before, I'd recommend 2 of these guys to 3 crossbowmen, and in battle they're of course best used for getting off an initial barrage against charging enemies. Once melee units are locked in combat, you need to move your handguns into positions at the flank so they can get clean shots. Follow these instructions and you should be shredding Black Orcs and Graveguard before you know it. The melee cavalry is one of the 2 categories that I'd say the Empire is best in. Starting us off is the Empire Knights, and they're pretty much your run-of-the-mill cav units. They're armoured and shielded, so have plenty of defence for both melee and ranged units. They're also anti-infantry, so if you get a good charge and some infantry, they're really going to have a bad day. As with most cav units, my best advice is to use them to flank around your enemies and take out key targets such as ranged infantry or artillery. Alternatively, you can use them for charging into the backs of the enemy front lines to cause a massive leadership penalty. I'd only recommend using them in the early game, as the later options of the Empire are so much better it's not even worth considering. So next up from Reichland are the Reichsguard. These guys are incredible in the mid game and can even be carried in your armies into the late game if you want. They're again armoured and shielded and also anti-infantry, so ruin the day of anything smaller than a horse. They have a massive charge bonus, so catching enemies off guard is essential for them, as one good charge will take away half of either a health or a leadership bar from almost any unit in the game. The usual strategies apply for these guys, but be sure not to leave them trapped in melee, as it's a total waste of potential to do anything other than cycle charging. As with most cav units, I'd recommend 2 units just to keep the army well balanced. Knights of the Blazing Sun are very similar to Reichsguard, and with some very slight stat differences. They're basically a little bit better in almost every category except armour and melee defence, but for some reason in campaign, I never found myself using them. I think it's something to do with unlocking them at the same time as demogryphs that made me overlook them, as they just didn't compare. If for some reason you don't want to take these guys though, they'll definitely do the job. They can get great charges into either melee troops or range units, causing lots of leadership and damage penalties. They're of course best used for cycle charging rather than leaving them in melee, and as usual I'd say 2 units is enough to fill their role. Demogryph Knights come in 2 varieties, Lancers and Halberds, and to save us some time, I'm just going to come out and say it, Halberds are better in every way. I know the stats tell a different story, but in battles I just find myself choosing them every time, and it seems to work well enough. They just seem to go through enemy units and can survive pretty well in melee, provided they aren't against anything too tough. Even though Demogryphs don't have the high stats of all cavalry, I bring them over anything else for the sole reason that they need less micromanagement. Their ability to survive in melee means you can send them after a key target and not have to worry about them too much for the starting rush of the battle. This doesn't mean you can just forget about them, as with all cavs they'll need to do some micro to make them effective, but it's nowhere near as much as other units need. For the most balanced army comp I take just 2 units of them and focus down key targets and flanks. Onto the Missile Cavalry now. And these are some of my favourite units in the Empire roster, starting off with Pistoliers. As with all Missile Cavalry units, they have Vanguard deployment so can start the battle much closer to the enemy than normal, to attack from unexpected directions. They have a pretty low damage output, but they are a very early game unit, so it doesn't matter too much as you won't be taking them into the late game. They are very fast so can get around enemies to shoot them in the back pretty easily, and that's exactly what you should use them for, as having them take on entire units by themselves won't go too well. As for how many to have in your armies, I'd again say 2 units should be enough to effectively flank front lines and cause a bit of trouble. Next up are Outriders, and these guys are where the Missile Cavalry starts to get fun. They have armour-piercing missiles so can shred through tough targets like Swiss cheese and are pretty much superior to Pistoliers in every way except speed. They have great range and can chip away at half the enemy's health and morale before they even reach the front lines, meaning your melee troops have the easiest job in the world. They're best used by deploying as close to the enemies you can get them using Vanguard, then blast a few volleys off on key targets before retreating so you don't get caught in melee. Beyond that, use them to attack flanks and focus down tougher enemies caught in melee. Oh, I forgot to mention they come in 2 variants, one with rifles and one with grenade launchers. Taking grenade launchers loses the ability to attack air units but makes them vastly superior at attacking all types of infantry. Not only will they cause more damage faster, but the explosions will also ruin enemy formations and can totally destroy units' morale before they even reach the fight. Again, I'd have to say 2 units is best for these guys in a balanced army. Finally, we're on to my favourite part of the Empire roster, and the other category that I'd say they're best in, Artillery. Kicking off artillery and the war machines is the mortar, and there's not really much to say. It's a strong early game anti-infantry artillery piece that if used correctly can rack up hundreds of kills. It's worth mentioning that on top of the fantastic range they also fire in an arc so can shoot right over the heads of the infantry you have. That means that as soon as the battle starts you can open fire on key targets as they charge into battle. As soon as units are locked in melee, look out for areas where groups of units are tightly packed together and focus fire there. Not only will this secure a lot of kills, but it'll also crush enemy morale as units are shredded by the explosive damage. In the early game I'd recommend between 2 and 4 units of these guys depending on what else you have unlocked. Great cannons are next up to the plate and they're pretty great. Whereas the mortar was great at racking up lots of kills on weak units, the Great Cannon excels at focusing down larger and more armoured targets. They have a good range but don't fire in a large arc, so need a clear line of sight to be effective. They also have armour piercing damage as well as an anti-large bonus, so can effectively chip away at large armoured units such as war mammoths. In fact, it's exactly what I'd say you should use them for, focusing one large target that would otherwise ruin your front lines. If you focus key targets enough, there should be no problem by the time they reach your actual troops. I'd recommend 2 units of cannons alongside 2 mortars in any early game army. The Hellstorm rocket battery is next, and these are possibly the most cinematic of all the artillery pieces in the game, and they aren't too bad in practice either. They have great arc range as well as armour piercing and anti-infantry, so are a godsend when attacking advancing infantry. The only major downside is that they have poor accuracy, meaning that once the front lines are established, it's dangerous to fire on them as you run the risk of friendly fire. But that being said, they are still a fantastic unit that I believe has a place on even a late game army, just due to the huge destruction they can rain down even on elite infantry. I like to take 2 of them into the late game along some more focused armour piercing units that we'll get onto in a minute. The Hellblaster volley gun is a unit that I haven't really used as much, as it didn't seem to find a place in any of my armies. It's by no means a bad unit, but it's just I've never found time when it was worth using over something else. Even the Great Cannon has a place over it, as it offers anti-large damage, whereas this only offers armour piercing, which however I have covered with the Hellstorm. If I were to use them, I'd say focusing down heavily armoured targets such as elite infantry or cav would be the best way, and if you did insist on bringing them, I'd only take 1 or 2 as they don't fill enough roles to warrant anything else. The Luminarch of Heish is a really cool unit. It fires armour-piercing missiles which do ungodly amounts of damage, called Solheim's Bolt of Illumination. They are insanely accurate and do tons of damage, but only have a small area of effect, so are best used for focusing key targets such as huge units or lords and heroes. This comes at the cost of a ridiculously slow firing rate, so you might do a lot of damage in one shot, but the actual DPS won't actually be that high. To top it all off, they have 2 aura abilities that buff nearby friendly units. They have the Aura of Protection that gives 12% magical resist to nearby units, as well as an activatable aura that adds to your winds of magic depending on how many enemy units are near. Overall, the Luminarch is a great addition to the Empire roster, but due to the slow firing rate and the next unit, I only ever take 1 of them in my armies. The final unit to the Empire roster is the Steam Tank. This behemoth is the only other fully mechanised unit other than the Doom Wheel available in the game. While it lacks the charging capabilities of the wheel, it has fantastic stats with great armour and armour-piercing damage. It can also cause terror, so units will suffer massive morale penalties just by being near to it. To put a cherry on top of that, it's also unbreakable, so will stay fighting until the very end. There isn't exactly a bad way you can use the Steam Tank aside from sending it chasing something it can't catch, but I find it best to get it in the front lines in a big group of enemy infantry where it can rack up a huge number of kills. I don't recommend bringing 1 however, as its application isn't needed as much as the other units in the army. Now onto the Regiments of Renown. I'll read off the names and what they're a variant of and show the stat differences between the regiment and the standard unit. First we have Sigmar's Sons, that are swordsman units. The Tattersouls, who are a Flagellants unit, I still don't know how to say that. Sterling's Revenge, who are a Free Company militia unit. The Silver Bullets, that are a handgunners unit. Zinslow's Reichsguard, who are a Reichsguard unit, big shocker there. The Royal Altdorf Griffites, which are a Demigriff Knights unit. The Hammer of the Witchers, which is a Great Cannon unit. The Sunmaker, which is a Hellstorm rocket battery, and finally the Temple of Luminarch, which is a Luminarch of Heish unit. That concludes this section of the guide on the Empire armies. The next section will cover the Lords and Heroes and what they can do for you both in the campaign and on the battlefield. Thanks for watching this section of my Empire race guide. If you want to check out the other parts, there's a link in the card and in the description to the playlist for the series. Don't forget to vote on the poll for the next race you want me to make a guide for, which is linked in the description. If you enjoy this video at any point, please consider leaving a like, as it really does help out a lot. And if you want to see more of this type of video, maybe click that subscribe button so you stay up to date. After all, it is free. For now though, I was COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I'll see you next turn.